The record began with a timestamp that made no sense. Engagement log. Varathi Combined Fleet Day 0 Cycle 14, 0733. I am Fleet Admiral Sauron Tel Morith of the Varathi Hegemony, Supreme Commander of the 7th Expansion Armada, and this is my personal operational record of the contact event at the Pellis boundary. I am filing it because someone must, and because the official account will not contain what matters. The official account will contain tonnage figures, approach vectors, fleet dispositions, and a sanitized timeline. It will not contain the part where I was wrong. I had been wrong from the first reading. Let me set the stage precisely, because precision is the only currency I have left. The Varathi Hegemony controlled 641 star systems across 3 galactic arms. Our fleet strength stood at 19,000 warships distributed across 11 standing armadas, supported by 42 mobile logistics platforms, 9 orbital foundry stations, and a combined crew complement of 11 million souls. We had fought 7 major wars in our recorded history and won all of them, not through ferocity but through a doctrine we called the calculation, the systematic, mathematical reduction of any threat to a set of variables that could be solved. Every enemy was a problem. Every problem had a solution. The solution was always the same: superior numbers applied with surgical efficiency at the moment of maximum vulnerability. This doctrine had never failed us. I want that understood, not once in 4,000 years. The Pellis boundary was the edge of charted space in Sector 9 Rho, a region of gravitational anomalies and thin stellar density where the main sequence stars grew sparse and the interstellar medium thickened into dark molecular clouds. Our long-range survey platforms had been mapping it for decades, cataloging systems for potential resource extraction. Standard colonial expansion. Nothing unusual. Then, 9 days before what I am about to describe, survey platform enduring record detected an anomalous energy signature at the far edge of its sensor range. Not a natural emission, not a known species drive signature. Something moving through the molecular clouds at a velocity our systems flagged as non-standard, not impossibly fast, not slow, just wrong. The platform's automated classification engine tried 604 pattern matches against our archives and returned no result. It escalated to its supervising station. The station escalated to Sector Command. Sector Command escalated to me. I was aboard the Throne of Ascent, the 7th Armada's flagship. 1,200 meters of layered composite armor and redundant weapon systems, crewed by 6,000 of the Hegemony's finest officers. I had commanded her for 32 years, since my promotion to Fleet Admiral at the age of 109. The throne had been my instrument in the last 2 wars, both victories, both concluded in fewer than 90 days, and I trusted her systems the way a surgeon trusts a blade. I reviewed the sensor data personally. The anomalous signature was moving along the inner boundary of the molecular clouds in a pattern that suggested deliberate navigation, not drift. Something was threading through the gravitational shoals of the Pellis boundary with a confidence that implied either very good astrogation or very good luck. "Show me the mass estimate," I said. My tactical officer, Subcommander Orith Vaz, pulled the numbers. Approximately 740,000 metric units, Fleet Admiral. Consistent with a vessel between 600 and 800 meters in length, depending on density assumptions. A single ship. One vessel, moving alone through the most treacherous navigational hazard in the sector, broadcasting no transponder signal, matching no known classification, and heading in the general direction of our colonial expansion corridor. I gave the order that began it. Assemble the interdiction force. We will investigate. I assigned 120 warships. This was not caution. This was the calculation. Our threat assessment models assigned any unknown vessel a provisional danger rating based on estimated mass, drive output, and behavioral indicators. A 700-meter vessel operating alone in disputed space received a rating of Class 4, significant enough to warrant a substantial response, not significant enough to justify the full armada. 120 ships against 1 was a ratio of overwhelming force that left no room for surprise. The calculation demanded certainty. 120 ships was certainty. I believed this. Record that. I believed it with the conviction of a commander who had never been wrong. The interdiction force assembled in 14 hours, forming a standard envelopment sphere at the far edge of the Pellis boundary, where the anomalous vessel's projected course would bring it into contact range. I commanded from the throne of ascent, positioned at the center of the formation. Around me, 119 warships held station in concentric shells, 32 heavy cruisers in the inner ring, 48 destroyers in the middle band, 39 fast frigates in the outer cordon. Each ship's crew had run combat readiness drills. Each ship's weapons were charged. Each ship's tactical systems were networked into my flagship's battle management array, feeding me a composite picture of the engagement space that covered every approach vector within 800,000 kilometers. We waited. The vessel emerged from the molecular clouds at 07/14/22 on the 9th day. It came slowly, not cautiously. I understand that distinction now, though I did not then. There is a difference between a thing that moves slowly because it is afraid and a thing that moves slowly because it does not need to hurry. The vessel drifted out of the cloud boundary the way a continent emerges from fog, not revealing itself but simply being revealed, and the first thing I noticed was not its size or its shape, but its silence. It broadcast nothing, no transponder, no identification signal, no hailing frequency, no drive emissions that matched any known propulsion system in our archives. The vessel moved and the space around it was quiet, and the quiet was wrong in a way I could not immediately articulate. Scan it, I ordered. The tactical array focused. 18 seconds of concentrated active scanning from 32 heavy cruisers, each projecting sensor beams across the full electromagnetic spectrum, enough energy to illuminate a small planet. The results came back, and Subcommander Vaz's voice changed. I had served with Vaz for 19 years. I knew every register of his voice, the clipped efficiency of routine operations, the controlled urgency of combat, the dry humor he permitted himself during maintenance cycles. The voice that read the scan results was none of these. It was the voice of an officer reading something that had fractured a thing inside his training, something his education had told him could not exist. Fleet Admiral, the hull composition does not match any known metallurgical profile. The alloy is unregistered. Structural density is approximately 4 times the standard for vessels of this displacement class. Hull surface analysis shows layered armor plating with evidence of extensive combat damage, scoring, kinetic impacts, energy weapon burns across multiple timescales. The oldest damage signatures are consistent with engagements dating back approximately 140 years. 140 years. The ship we were looking at had been fighting for longer than most Vorathi officers lived. Weapons profile, I said. My voice was steady. I made certain of that. Magnetic accelerator arrays, rail-type kinetic launchers. 24 primary mounts distributed across forward, dorsal, and ventral positions. Bore diameter and magnetic flux readings indicate projectile masses in the 60-kilogram range at velocities between 5 and 8% of light speed. Additionally, directed energy emitters, coherent beam weapons with crystal focusing, arrays capable of sustained output over 90-second cycles, 16 mounts, and Fleet Admiral, a pause that lasted 3 seconds longer than professionalism allowed. The vessel carries a torpedo battery along its dorsal ridge, with magazine capacity estimated at over 600 warheads. The warhead profiles suggest shaped charge designs optimized for deep armor penetration. Each warhead carries yield sufficient to breach a Vorathi heavy cruiser's primary hull in a single detonation. I processed the numbers with the discipline of 141 years of life and 32 of command. 24 rail guns capable of throwing 60-kilogram slugs at 8% of light speed, each impact carrying kinetic energy roughly equivalent to our heaviest ship-to-ship torpedo, the weapon that required its own dedicated reactor and a crew of 6 to operate. 16 directed energy weapons with precision tracking. 600 torpedoes, each one a hull killer. On a single hull that measured 740 meters. The calculation adjusted, the numbers shifted. 120 ships was still sufficient. The mathematics was clear on this point. But the margin had narrowed in a way that produced an unfamiliar sensation in my thorax, a tightness I recognized as the physical precursor to what the lesser species called anxiety. I had not felt it in decades. I dismissed it. The calculation did not accommodate anxiety. "Hail them," I said. "Standard first contact protocol, all frequencies." The hail went out at full power across every communication band the hegemony had ever used or intercepted. We waited. The vessel continued its slow drift out of the molecular clouds, and its silence continued with it, enormous and deliberate. No response, Fleet Admiral. Repeat, maximum power broadband. Add the 3 diplomatic preambles. Another wait, 60 seconds of broadcast, nothing returned. "They are either unable or unwilling to communicate," Vaz said, and I heard the undertone beneath the professional assessment. "They are choosing this silence." "Then we will communicate for them." I opened the fleet channel. "All ships advance to contact range. Envelopment Protocol 7. We box them, scan them at close range, and determine their intent. Weapons free on my command only." 120 warships began to close the distance. The formation moved with the precision I demanded, each ship holding its position within the concentric shells, the net tightening around the single contact with the mathematical elegance, the calculation prescribed for unknown interdictions. At 400,000 kilometers, the vessel's drive output changed. Not dramatically, not a surge or a flare. A modulation, subtle, deliberate, the kind of adjustment that spoke of an engine being eased from standby into readiness by hands that had done it 10,000 times before. Our sensors logged a 12% increase in thermal output across the vessel's aft section, consistent with a reactor moving from cruise to elevated readiness. The thermal bloom spread across 4 previously cold engine ports, each one igniting with a faint amber glow that our optical arrays captured in sharp detail against the dark molecular clouds. At 300,000 kilometers, the vessel altered course. Again, not dramatically. A gentle correction, 5 degrees to port, that brought its angular bow to face the center of our formation, facing the throne of ascent, facing my command deck, facing me. "They've turned toward us," Vaz said. "Unnecessary." I could see it on every display in the command center, the single marker rotating to present its forward aspect to the densest concentration of our force. Acknowledged, continue approach. At 200,000 kilometers, our passive sensors detected something new. The vessel's hull had begun emitting low-frequency electromagnetic pulses in a regular pattern, one pulse every 4.3 seconds, precise enough to set a chronometer by. Our signals analysts spent 47 seconds identifying them. The pulses were not communication. They were active sensor sweeps. The vessel was scanning us. It was scanning us while we scanned it, with the unhurried methodology of a surgeon examining a patient rather than a prey animal assessing a predator, and the realization that it had waited until we were committed to the approach before beginning its own assessment produced a second pulse of that thoracic tightness. At 150,000 kilometers, the signals analysis team flagged an anomaly that changed the texture of everything. Fleet Admiral, we are detecting modulated carrier waves embedded in the vessel's sensor emissions. They match no known communication protocol, but the modulation patterns show mathematical structure consistent with compressed data transmission. High density, encrypted directional. They are transmitting. Not to us, Fleet Admiral. The carrier wave is tightly directional. It is aimed at a point approximately 4.7 light hours behind the vessel's emergence point, into the molecular clouds, into the region our sensors cannot penetrate. The vessel was talking to something we could not see, something behind it, hidden in the dark clouds where our instruments could not reach, something it had been in contact with, presumably, since before we had assembled the interdiction force. Can you determine the content? Negative. The encryption is unlike anything in our archives. Our cryptographic systems estimate a brute force decryption time of approximately 14,000 years. I should have paused. I know that now with the clarity that only mistakes provide. The calculations threat assessment models had a specific protocol for this scenario, Protocol 7 Keth, the unseen asset doctrine. When an unknown vessel demonstrates communication with unseen assets, the prescribed response is to halt approach, widen formation, extend sensor range, and reassess before committing further. I had read the protocol. I had taught the protocol to junior officers. I had tested them on it in 3 separate tactical examinations. I did not follow it. Why? Because the calculation also contained a principle that ranked higher than caution in the hierarchy of doctrine. The principle of demonstrated supremacy. When confronting an unknown threat, the most efficient resolution is to demonstrate overwhelming force immediately, compelling the unknown to reveal its capabilities without requiring engagement. Show your strength, and the enemy either submits or reveals what it will use against you. Either outcome is useful. Either outcome feeds the calculation. 120 ships closing on one ship was a demonstration of supremacy so complete that no rational adversary would fail to respond. They would either stand down, flee, or fight, and in any of those cases the calculation would have its data. The doctrine was clear. The mathematics was clear. The precedent of 4,000 years was clear. Continue approach. All ships bring weapons to ready status. Charge all primary batteries. At 100,000 kilometers, the vessel did something that I will remember for the rest of my life. It stopped. Not decelerated. Not drifted to a halt through a braking sequence. It stopped, with a precision that implied complete authority over its own inertia, holding position with 0 residual velocity relative to the surrounding medium. Our sensors registered no braking burn, no retrothrust, no gravitational manipulation, no recognizable deceleration mechanism of any kind. The vessel was moving at 1,400 meters per second, and then it was stationary, and the transition occupied less time than our instruments could measure. Our tracking systems briefly flagged it as a sensor malfunction. A hard contact cannot simply cease all motion without expending energy, before 3 independent sensor nets confirmed the reading. Nothing in our archives could do that. No drive technology we had ever encountered, analyzed, cataloged, or theorized could arrest momentum that completely, that instantaneously, without visible energy expenditure. The physics of it did not fit the models. It did not fit any models. Fleet Admiral, Vaz said, and the quality in his voice had deepened into something I had never heard from him. The voice of a 19-year veteran who was watching his understanding of what warships could do crack down the center. The vessel's reactor output just increased by 400%. It is no longer at elevated readiness. It is at full combat power. All weapon mounts are energized. Targeting systems are active. The vessel hung in space, 740 meters of angular hull facing my fleet with its 24 railgun mounts and 16 beam emitters powered and tracking, and it waited. I gave the order to halt at 80,000 kilometers. The formation held 120 warships in concentric shells with every weapon system charged and aimed at the single contact that sat in the darkness ahead of us with the patient stillness of something that had done this before, many times before, and knew precisely how it would end. Open a channel, all frequencies, translate into every known language in the archive. Every diplomatic prefix we have. Vaz compiled and broadcast. We waited 90 seconds that felt like 90 years. The response came not as voice, not as text, but as a data packet, a compressed burst of information that arrived on a frequency our communications array had to recalibrate twice to receive. The signal's analysts decoded it in 11 minutes of concentrated effort and put it on my screen. It was a file, a single file containing a list. I read it, and the thoracic tightness became something else entirely. The file contained 217 entries. Each entry was a record of an engagement, a battle fought by this vessel or vessels of its class against hostile forces. Each record was sparse and clinical, containing nothing more than a date, a location reference in a coordinate system we did not recognize, an enemy force composition rendered in unit counts and estimated tonnages, and an outcome. The dates spanned 137 years. The enemy force compositions ranged from single-ship encounters to fleet engagements against formations numbering in the hundreds, and in 3 cases, the thousands. Every outcome was the same. One word, repeated 217 times in what our linguists identified as a human language, the archive designated Standard English. Resolved. 217 engagements over 137 years. Against forces that included species I recognized, the Tesserae Convergence, whose 6th Expeditionary Fleet had vanished without explanation 7 decades ago. The Dralathi Communion, whose unexplained withdrawal from the Kessar Corridor 41 years ago had puzzled hegemony intelligence analysts for a generation. The Helistari Trade Confederation, whose border fleets had contracted by 30% in a single decade with no public explanation. Every one of those historical mysteries was answered in a single clinical line on the list in front of me. Resolved. Some of the recorded enemy fleet compositions dwarfed my interdiction force. Entry 81, 194 hostile warships. Entry 144, 312. Entry 189, 427. Entry 203, 609 warships arrayed against a single battle group of vessels identical to the one facing me now. Resolved. I stared at the list, and for the first time in 32 years of command, the calculation failed to produce a number that reassured me. The mathematics still said 120 to 1. The list said 217 to 0. Fleet Admiral, Vaz said, and his voice was steady only because he was forcing it to be. We have cross-referenced the engagement records against known historical events in our deep archive. The Tesserae Convergence's loss of their 6th Expeditionary Fleet, dates and coordinates match. The Dralathi Communion's withdrawal from the Kessar Corridor, confirmed. The Helistari contraction, confirmed. These are not fabricated records, Fleet Admiral. These events occurred exactly as described. What species built this vessel? The linguistic analysis identifies the language as Human Standard English. The vessel is of Terran origin, Fleet Admiral, human. Human, the word settled onto my command deck like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples spread to every officer present. The hegemony had files on humans. Brief files, barely 4 pages in the species compendium. A mid-tier civilization occupying a handful of systems in an unremarkable sector of the galactic southeast, known primarily for their persistence, their unusual biological tolerance for environmental extremes, and their disproportionate investment in military hardware relative to their territorial holdings. They were classified as a regional power of limited expansion potential, threat rating Class 2, the second lowest tier, reserved for species that posed no strategic concern to the hegemony's interests. Class 2. That rating had been assigned 80 years ago by a survey team that had observed human space from a distance of 40 light-years and never updated its assessment. I was looking at a single vessel that had fought 217 engagements across 137 years and had never lost, bearing the scars of every battle on its hull like a chronicle written in scorched metal, and our archive rated its builders as a Class 2 nuisance fit to be noted and forgotten. Reclassify, I said, the word emerging before the thought behind it had fully formed. Immediately, reclassify the species threat assessment. To what level, Fleet Admiral? I did not answer immediately, because the calculation required data to assign a rating, and the data I had was a list of victories that violated every assumption the model was built on. A Class 2 species does not produce warships that serve for 140 years. A Class 2 species does not fight 217 engagements without defeat. A Class 2 species does not send a single vessel into the path of 120 warships and wait. Hold! I stared at the tactical display. The vessel sat at the center of it like a stone in a river, a single contact marker surrounded by 120 of mine. The ratio was still overwhelming. The mathematics still favored us on every axis the calculation measured. But mathematics, I was beginning to understand, operated on assumptions. And assumptions, when they encountered a list of 217 resolved engagements, could be catastrophically wrong. What is the vessel's current status? Holding position, full combat power, all weapons tracking. No additional transmissions beyond the file it sent us. It is. Vaz hesitated, searching for a word that fit what the sensors were telling him. Waiting, Fleet Admiral. Waiting, not retreating, not advancing, not attempting to flee from a force that outnumbered it 120 to 1, not broadcasting surrender, distress, or negotiation. Just waiting, with the patience of something that had faced worse odds 217 times and found those odds insufficient to concern it. The next 12 hours changed everything I understood about war. I did not attack. I want that recorded clearly because the official account will frame the decision as tactical prudence, and it was not entirely. The decision not to fire was mine, and it was made from something older than fear and more honest than doctrine. The Vorathi word is Kithron, which translates imperfectly as the discipline of seeing, the principle that a commander who attacks without understanding what they are fighting is not brave but wasteful. The calculation demanded efficiency, and efficiency demanded comprehension, and comprehension required time. I ordered a deep analysis cycle. Every sensor on every ship in the formation focused on the human vessel for 12 continuous hours, gathering data at a resolution that would normally be reserved for geological surveys of mineral-rich planets. We mapped its hull down to individual plate seams and weld lines. We profiled its energy output across every detectable spectrum. We analyzed its armor composition through passive spectral reading at 4 different wavelength ranges. We modeled its weapons systems based on the mount configurations visible through our optical arrays, cross-referencing against the engagement records it had provided. During those 12 hours, 3 things happened that moved the engagement from an interdiction into something I had no doctrine for. The first was the drive analysis. Our engineering specialists completed their assessment of the vessel's propulsion system at hour 4 and delivered a report that my chief physicist, a woman of 206 years and impeccable credentials, delivered personally because she refused to trust the content to a subordinate. The drive produced a field effect that our physicists could not categorize. It was not a conventional reaction drive. It was not an Alcubierre-type metric distortion. It was not a graviton manipulation system, or a dimensional fold, or any of the 11 theoretical propulsion models the hegemony's physics colleges had identified as plausible. It operated on principles that did not correspond to any theoretical framework in Vorathi physics, not merely unknown technology, but technology that implied unknown physics. The best our team could produce was a description rather than an explanation. The drive appeared to manipulate the relationship between the vessel's mass and the surrounding spacetime geometry in a way that allowed arbitrary velocity changes without corresponding energy expenditure. The vessel's earlier instantaneous stop was not an anomaly or a single-use capability. It was a baseline function. The vessel could do it continuously, repeatedly, at will. A warship that could go from full speed to zero without braking. That could change direction without turning arcs. That could accelerate without burning fuel in any way our sensors could detect. A warship that had solved the fundamental constraint of momentum that limited every other fleet in known space. I read the engineering report twice and felt the calculation. The system I had built my career, my identity, my understanding of warfare upon, strained like a beam carrying weight it was not designed for. The second event occurred at hour 7. Our passive sensors detected a new energy signature emerging from the molecular clouds, along the same vector the first vessel had used. Then another. Then 4 more in quick succession, each signature resolving into a hard contact on our tactical arrays within seconds of the last. Over the course of 90 minutes, 17 additional vessels materialized on our displays, each one emerging from the dark clouds with the same unhurried confidence as the first. No haste, no defensive formation, no visible concern about the 120 armed warships waiting for them. 17 vessels, identical drive signatures, identical mass profiles, the same angular hull configuration, the same weapons complement visible through our optical scans, the same 140-year accumulation of battle scarring on hulls that bore it like insignia rather than damage. Some of them carried repair patches so old the metal had oxidized into colors the original hull had never been, and the patches themselves had been patched, and those patches had been patched again. Layer upon layer of survival, century upon century of refusal to die. One vessel had been a curiosity. 18 vessels was a formation, a battle group, and the way they arranged themselves as they emerged, not in a defensive cluster, not in an offensive line, not in any formation our doctrine recognized as aggressive or submissive, but in a loose, relaxed dispersal pattern that suggested they could transition to any tactical geometry instantaneously, told me something the calculations threat models had no category for. They were not afraid of us. They were not concerned by us. 120 Vorathi warships, the pride of the 7th Expansion Armada, armed and ready and surrounding them, and the 18 human vessels arranged themselves as if we were weather. Something to be noted and accounted for, not something to be feared. I ordered no response. I held the formation and continued the analysis cycle, because the discipline of seeing demanded that I understand what I was looking at before I decided what to do about it. But the calculation's confidence interval, the numerical expression of how certain the doctrine was of the outcome, had dropped below 90% for the first time since I had assumed command. 87%, still favorable, still overwhelming, still a number the calculation called sufficient. I told myself that. I recorded it in the engagement log at the time, and I record here that I did not fully believe it. The third event occurred at hour 11. Subcommander Vaz pulled me from my analysis review with a voice I had never heard from him in 19 years of service together. Flat, stripped of affect, every trace of personality burned away by what was on his screen, the voice of a professional delivering information he wished he did not possess. Fleet Admiral, long-range sensors have detected additional contacts entering the Pellis boundary. How many? A pause. The kind of pause that contains the sound of a man rereading his display, because the first reading could not possibly be correct, and the second reading confirmed it, and the third reading made him wish he had chosen a different career. 241. Fleet Admiral. Drive signatures consistent with the original vessel. They are arriving from multiple vectors, some from the molecular clouds, some from deep space beyond our previous sensor range, some from positions within the boundary itself. They appear to have been there for some time. I stood very still. Clarify, they were already in position. Passive backtracking analysis suggests they have been present in the boundary region for a minimum of 72 hours, Fleet Admiral. They were running completely silent, zero emissions, no drive activity, no thermal signature, no electromagnetic output of any kind. Our survey platforms passed within detection range of several groups and registered nothing. The platforms were not malfunctioning. Their instruments were operating within normal parameters. The vessels were simply invisible to them until they chose not to be. 72 hours. 3 full days. 241 warships had been sitting in the dark around us for 3 days, silent and patient and watching, while I assembled my interdiction force and briefed my captains, and moved my ships into position with the confidence of a commander who believed he was the one doing the surrounding. The total was 259 human warships against my 120. The mathematics had inverted, but the number was not the thing that restructured my understanding. The number was secondary. The thing that mattered, the thing that I stared at on my tactical display, while my officers waited for orders and my doctrine waited for relevance, was the implication. They had been there first. We had detected one vessel emerging from the clouds and assembled a force to intercept it, operating on the assumption that we were responding to an incursion, and the entire time they had already positioned 259 warships around us in a containment pattern so thorough that every ship in my formation was within weapons range of at least 4 human vessels. The single ship had not been a scout wandering into our territory. It had been the visible piece, the bait, the lure. The part we were meant to see, designed to draw our response and our disposition and our doctrine into the open where it could be assessed. Everything else had been waiting, patient, silent, present since before we arrived. I sat in my command throne, the ancient seat of carved obsidian and living crystal that had served the 7th Armada's commanders for 900 years, and I looked at the tactical display, now populated with 259 markers, in a dispersal pattern that completely enclosed my formation, and I felt something I had not felt since I was a junior officer aboard my first patrol frigate 132 years ago. Respect. Not fear, though fear was present, coiled beneath the professional composure I maintained for the benefit of my officers. Not panic, which would have been an insult to both myself and the force facing me, but respect. A recognition, cold and total and humbling, that I was facing a military force that had outthought me at every stage of this engagement. They had ceded the boundary before we arrived. They had shown us one ship to draw our response. They had given us 12 hours of scanning time, not because they were passive, but because they wanted us to see what we were facing before the rest of them revealed themselves. They had conducted the entire operation, because it had been an operation from the moment their first ship entered our sensor range. I understood that now, with a strategic patience and an operational sophistication that the calculation had no formula for. This was not a Class II species. This was not a regional power of limited expansion potential with brief files in the compendium. This was a civilization that had been fighting wars for longer than the Vorathi had been cataloging them, that built warships which served for a century and a half, and had never been defeated, that understood military deception and strategic patience at a level our doctrine had never needed to account for because we had never encountered anything that required it. I made the decision at 06:44, 11 on the 10th day. All ships stand down weapons, power down primary batteries, Bring shields to passive configuration. Hold position. Vaz looked at me. Several officers on the command deck turned from their stations. I could feel their confusion, sharp and immediate, and beneath it something softer, relief that someone had made a decision, even if the decision was surrender of the initiative. Fleet Admiral, our orders from High Command are to interdict and identify any. I am aware of our orders, Subcommander. I am also aware that we are surrounded by 259 warships of a class that our archives have catastrophically underestimated, commanded by a species we have spent 80 years ignoring, and that engaging them would not produce the outcome the calculation predicts because the calculation is operating on assumptions that are fundamentally, demonstrably, and dangerously incorrect. We will not fire. That is my order, and I will record it as such. I opened a channel to the human formation. Broadband, all frequencies, maximum power, no encryption. This is Fleet Admiral Sauron Tel Morith of the Vorathi Hegemony, commanding the 7th Expansion Armada. We are standing down our weapons. We do not seek conflict. We seek to understand what we have encountered. Our archives were incomplete, and we acknowledge this openly. If you are willing to communicate, we are willing to listen. The silence lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. I counted every one of them, because counting was the only function my mind could perform while I waited to learn whether the last 10 days had been an engagement, a test, or a prelude to annihilation. Then the reply came, not a data burst, not a file. A voice, translated clearly, through some mechanism that had learned our language well enough to render it naturally, with the slight formality of a speaker addressing someone they had been studying for a long time and had finally decided to speak to. This is Captain Lena Vasic of the Terran Strategic Navy Vessel Corrigan, commanding Battle Group Sentinel. Fleet Admiral Morith, your decision to stand down is noted and respected. The Terran Strategic Navy has been aware of the Vorathi hegemony for 47 years. We have observed your expansion into the Pellis boundary for the past 9. We positioned Battle Group Sentinel here 6 days ago when your survey platform detected the Corrigan's approach, because your response to that detection would tell us whether the Vorathi were a species that could be spoken to or a species that had to be answered. Spoken to or answered. The distinction was precise, surgical, and it cut deeper than any weapon in my arsenal. You showed us one ship, I said. We showed you one ship, Captain Vasic confirmed, and her voice carried no triumph, no gloating, no satisfaction at the admission, only the steady calm of a professional stating a fact. Because the measure of a civilization is not what it does when it holds superiority. It is what it does when it encounters something it does not understand. You encountered something your archives could not classify, Fleet Admiral. You surrounded it with 120 warships. And then, when you realized the situation was not what you calculated, you chose to lower your weapons and speak. That choice is why we are having this conversation instead of a different one. I heard the words and I understood them as a judgment rendered, not hostile, not condemning, an assessment conducted with the same clinical precision the Vorathi would have applied to any species they encountered, by a civilization that had been doing the same mathematics from the other side of the equation for nearly half a century. They had watched us. They had studied us. They had positioned themselves to test us. And the test had not been whether we could fight. That question, the engagement record made clear, had been answered 217 times already. But whether we could recognize in the face of the unknown that fighting was not the only answer. Captain Vasic, I said, the Vorathi hegemony has spent 4,000 years building an archive that we believed contained everything worth knowing about the galaxy. We have cataloged 11,000 species, mapped 900,000 star systems, and assembled the most comprehensive intelligence database in known history. Today I am looking at 259 reasons to accept that it was incomplete. I paused. I have questions, many of them. But the first is this: are you willing to talk? Another pause. Shorter this time, 3 seconds rather than 4 minutes. When the reply came, there was something in the translated voice that our linguistic analysis systems flagged as warmth, though the word feels inadequate for what it conveyed. Fleet Admiral Morith, Battle Group Sentinel has been waiting 6 days for you to ask that question. Yes, we are willing to talk. I ordered the Throne of Ascent to advance, alone, toward the Corrigan. My officers objected. The calculation objected. Every protocol in the hegemony's operational doctrine objected. Vaz opened his mouth to cite the regulation that prohibited a fleet commander from separating from his formation in the presence of a hostile force, and I raised one hand, my primary hand, the command hand, and he closed his mouth. They are not hostile, I said. If they were, we would not be having this conversation. We would not be having anything. The throne advanced at 1/4 speed, alone, through the dispersal of human warships that parted to let us pass with the courtesy of sentries acknowledging a visitor, rather than the wariness of enemies permitting an approach. At 5,000 kilometers, the Corrigan filled our forward optical arrays. She was 740 meters of angular hull, and up close she told me more than the scan data ever had. The ship was old, not derelict, not decaying, not neglected, but aged in the way a cherished tool ages when it is used constantly and maintained with devotion by hands that understand its value. The hull plating bore 140 years of battle damage, energy burns layered over kinetic impacts layered over older energy burns, the damage signatures spanning the full range of weapons employed by a dozen different species across more than a century of conflict. And over that damage, equally layered, 140 years of repair. Every scar had been tended. Every breach had been sealed with whatever material was available, alloys that did not match the original hull, composites from species the Corrigan had outlived, patches that had themselves been patched by later crews, creating a surface that was part original construction, part field repair, part archaeological record. The newest patches gleamed. The oldest had oxidized into colors the original alloy had never been designed to produce. It should have looked crude, jury-rigged, a ship held together by stubbornness and emergency welds. Instead, it looked like something else entirely. It looked like endurance. This ship had been hurt, many times by many enemies, across a span of time that exceeded any service life in the Vorathi fleet by a factor of 5. And it had been healed, every time, by crews that cared enough to keep it whole, generation after generation, handing the ship down like an inheritance more valuable than territory, each crew adding their repairs to the ones that came before, until the hull itself became a record of everything the vessel had survived and everyone who had kept it alive. I thought of the Throne of Ascent, 32 years under my command, state-of-the-art, immaculate, and I understood for the first time that my flagship was a child's instrument compared to what I was looking at. Not in tonnage, not in weapon systems, in commitment. The Corrigan's crew had not merely served aboard their vessel, they had inherited it. They had been born knowing its corridors, raised on its history, and they would die knowing that the next crew would patch whatever damage their generation's wars had left, and the ship would go on after them. We had built our doctrine around the idea that ships were instruments to be used, maintained on schedule, and replaced when their service life expired. The humans had built something else. They had built continuity vessels that outlived the crews that sailed them and became something a species could build its identity around, fight for, die for, and pass forward. The docking took 3 hours of careful maneuvering. I boarded the Corrigan with a security detail of 4, the minimum the protocol allowed and the maximum the gesture of trust would bear. The interior confirmed everything the hull had suggested. Narrow corridors built for a species 1/3 my height, low ceilings that forced my officers to hunch, every surface bearing the marks of long habitation and constant use. Equipment bolted to walls with mounting hardware, that showed 3 different generations of fastener design. Gravity plates that hummed with a faint vibration suggesting piecemeal replacement over decades. Lighting that shifted between warm yellow and cool blue as we moved between sections, reflecting different eras of installation and different crew's preferences. Captain Vasic met me at the central command space. She was smaller than I expected. Humans always were, perhaps 175 centimeters, with the compact build and efficient motion of a species that had evolved under gravity 14% stronger than the Vorathi homeworlds. Her face was lined in ways our dermatological analysts would later identify as markers of a biological age near 50 standard years, though her eyes, steady, dark, carrying the specific calm of someone who has made decisions that mattered and lived with their weight, belonged to a much older soul. We stood in the command center of a vessel that could have fought my entire interdiction force to a standstill, surrounded by consoles that had been rebuilt 4 times and bulkheads that bore the chemical traces of 6 generations of crew, and she extended her hand. I had no cultural context for the gesture. My linguistic advisor, a specialist in xenosocial customs, murmured that it was a greeting, a human tradition, originating in their pre-spaceflight history, signifying the absence of a weapon in the dominant manipulating limb, an offer of peace encoded in the body's oldest language. I extended my primary hand, larger than hers by half, 4-fingered where hers had 5, the skin rough and plated where hers was smooth, and we held the contact for 3 seconds. Her grip was firm and steady and entirely without theatrics. Just a clasp between 2 officers who had spent 10 days measuring each other across a tactical display and arrived, through different calculations, at the same conclusion. "Fleet Admiral Morith," she said, and her voice in person carried the same qualities as it had through the translation system, precise, unhurried, carrying authority without volume. "Welcome aboard the Corrigan. She's 140 years old, she rattles when the drive engages, and she doesn't like strangers. But she'll tolerate you because I told her to." I looked around the command center. The ancient consoles worn smooth by 10,000 hands. The patched conduits where 3 different insulation materials met at junctions no engineer had planned. The hull plating that had held atmosphere for 14 decades through every kind of damage the galaxy could inflict. And I felt something that was not in the calculations vocabulary. Something the Vorathi language has no word for, because we have never needed one. The humans, I would learn later, call it awe. "Captain Vasic," I said, "in 4,000 years the Vorathi hegemony has never encountered a vessel we could not classify. We have never faced a force we could not calculate. And we have never stood inside a ship that made us reconsider what it means to build one." I paused, searching for the right word. Not in my language, which had 100 terms for tactical advantage and none for what I was feeling. I searched in the human language that the Corrigan's translation system had been teaching me fragments of over the past 12 hours. The experience has been humbling. Vasic studied me for a moment, a long, measuring look that I recognized because I had given the same look to adversaries and allies for 132 years. Then she nodded, once, the way one professional acknowledges another across the divide of species and doctrine, and 4,000 years of different answers to the same questions. "That's the word, Fleet Admiral. That's always the word." She turned and gestured toward a corridor leading deeper into the ship, past bulkheads that bore the handprints of crews who had died before she was born. "Come, I'll show you what 140 years of not giving up looks like from the inside, and then we'll talk about what comes next for both of us." I followed her into the corridor. Behind me, through the hull of the Corrigan, I could feel the faint vibration of 259 human warships holding station around my fleet, patient and steady and waiting, as they had been waiting for 47 years, as they would wait for however long was necessary. Engagement log, Vorathi Combined Fleet Day 10, Cycle 1933-07. The record continues, the Corrigan continues, the conversation continues. Addendum Day 12. Captain Vasic showed me the Corrigan's memorial wall. It occupied the entire length of the central corridor on Deck 3, a passage 60 meters long and 3 meters wide, and every centimeter of wall space was covered. Names, thousands of them, etched into metal plaques that had been mounted, replaced, remounted, and supplemented over 140 years. Each plaque bore a name, a rank, a date of service, and a single line, a personal note from the crew member who followed them, the one who had inherited their bunk, their station, their responsibilities. Some of the oldest plaques had been etched so many times the original text was barely legible, worn by the touch of generations who ran their fingers across the names of people they had never met but whose work had kept the ship alive long enough for them to serve aboard it. Every crew adds to it, Vasic said, walking slowly, her fingers trailing the wall the way mine trailed the Throne of Ascent's command crystal. First thing a new officer does aboard the Corrigan is read the wall. All of it takes about 4 hours. By the time they're done, they understand what they're part of. I calculated. At the crew complement the Corrigan appeared to carry, approximately 400, based on the berth configurations we had observed, and with crew rotations averaging 15 to 20 years, the wall represented 7 to 9 complete generations of personnel. 7 to 9 cycles of human lives, each one brief by Vorathi standards, each one spent maintaining, fighting, repairing, and ultimately passing forward a vessel that would outlive every individual who served aboard it. We replace our warships every 60 years, I said. Standard service life. Decommission, scrap, build new. Vasic looked at me with an expression I had not learned to read yet, something between surprise and what I would later identify as pity. We don't scrap ships, Fleet Admiral, not if they can still fight. The Corrigan's keel was laid 142 years ago. She's had her reactor replaced twice, her main drives rebuilt 3 times, her weapons upgraded 6 times, and her hull patched so many times there's probably more repair material than original construction. But the keel is the same. The bones are the same, and as long as the bones hold, she fights. The bones are the same. I turned the phrase over in my mind and understood, with a clarity that the calculation could not have produced, why the engagement record listed 217 victories and 0 defeats. It was not merely the weapons, though they were formidable. It was not merely the impossible drive technology, though it violated our physics. It was this, the wall, the names. The fact that every crew member who served aboard the Corrigan knew they were inheriting a responsibility that predated them by a century, and would outlast them by however long it took for the keel to finally give. And that knowledge, that weight of continuity, produced a kind of resolve that no threat assessment model could quantify. How do you defeat a ship whose crew does not fight for territory, or resources, or political advantage, but for the accumulated legacy of 9 generations of their dead? The calculation has no answer. I suspect it never will. Addendum Day 15. The diplomatic channel has been established. The Terran Strategic Navy has assigned a liaison officer to the 7th Armada, and the hegemony has reciprocated. The talks are proceeding in a language neither side invented, a pidgin of Vorathi formal speech and human standard English that our linguists and theirs are building in real time, word by word, each term negotiated for precision. Captain Vasic and I have met 4 times since the initial contact. Each meeting has lasted between 3 and 6 hours. She is direct in a way that Vorathi find abrasive, and I find increasingly valuable. She does not perform deference. She does not modulate her assessments to spare feelings. She states what she sees with the flat honesty of an officer who has commanded a warship through engagements that would have ended my career, and she did not survive them by being diplomatic. In our 3rd meeting, I asked her the question that had been sitting in my record for 5 days. Why did you wait? You had 259 warships. We had 120. You could have destroyed us at any point in the first 10 days. Why give us the choice? She was quiet for a long time, longer than I had observed her be quiet about anything. Because destroying you would have been easy, Fleet Admiral. And the Terran Strategic Navy stopped being interested in easy a long time ago. She leaned forward, and her eyes held mine with an intensity that transcended species. We've fought 217 engagements. We've resolved every one. We've broken fleets, shattered armadas, rendered entire military doctrines obsolete in the span of an afternoon. And none of it, not one engagement, not one victory, has ever given us what we actually want. Which is someone worth talking to. Final note, appended by Fleet Admiral Sauron Tel Morith, 17 days after initial contact. The hegemony's threat classification system has been formally revised by order of the High Council, based on my recommendation and the supporting evidence of this record. The human species designation Terran, homeworld designation Earth, primary military organization designation Terran Strategic Navy, has been reclassified from Threat Class 2 to a designation that did not exist before this contact event and had to be created specifically to accommodate what they represent. Class 0, Peer Civilization, Strategic Equal. In 4,000 years of the calculation, across 11,000 cataloged species and 7 major wars, the Vorathi hegemony has never assigned that rating to any civilization. The category did not exist because we believed no civilization warranted it. The humans earned it by showing us one ship and waiting to see what we would do. 259 warships, 217 engagements without defeat, 140 years of continuous service on a single hull, a memorial wall 60 meters long carrying the names of 9 generations of crew who lived and fought and died aboard a vessel that outlasted every one of them and will outlast every one of us. An impossible drive that our physics cannot explain, a patience that our doctrine cannot model. And a captain who told me, without bravado or false modesty, that the most powerful battle group in known space had been waiting 6 days for an alien admiral to ask if they could talk. The thing that mattered most was not the weapons, not the numbers, not the drive technology or the hull endurance or the century and a half of unbroken combat record. It was the patience. They could have destroyed us at any point in the first 10 days. They chose instead to let us decide what kind of species we were. And when we chose correctly, when I chose correctly, though I cannot claim it was wisdom rather than the accumulated weight of a doctrine that demanded understanding before destruction, they met us not as enemies, not as subjects, not as another entry in a list of resolved engagements, but as equals. The calculation has been updated. The Pellis boundary is no longer a frontier zone awaiting colonial expansion. It is a border. And on the other side of it, the Terran Strategic Navy, Battle Group Sentinel, 259 warships, one captain named Vasek who speaks as if truth were the only currency worth spending, is waiting, as it has been waiting for 47 years, with the extraordinary patience of a species that builds warships to outlast the generations who fly them, and teaches those generations that the measure of strength is not what you can destroy, but what you choose not to. I have been a fleet admiral for 32 years. I have commanded the largest armada in Vorathi history. I have won wars, expanded an empire, cataloged species, and believed with the certainty of 4,000 years of precedent that the calculation was the highest expression of military thought in the galaxy. I was wrong, and being wrong for the first time has taught me more than 4,000 years of being right. This record is complete. Fleet Admiral Sauron Tel Morith. 7th Expansion Armada, Vorathi Hegemony. Pellis Boundary Contact, Day 17.